Hey guys, it's Iziah Thompson from Daily Clout, covering what happened last week in Congress. I'm going to go over some House bills and some Senate bills and really take a look at what's going on politically and what you might have missed this week. There were some really big ticket items that I think you either probably know about or maybe these are things that flew under the radar. So I'm going to get going on these very quickly. The Farm Bill, which many people talked about, it was in the news quite well, but I want to get a really in-depth look at what it was. I'll start with saying that it did fail in the Senate after passing the House 26 to 20. So pretty much this bill, the Agriculture and Nutrition Act, also called the Farm Bill by many, was going to reauthorize numerous U.S. Department of Agriculture and the SNAP program, essentially programs to the year 2023. Along with that, reauthorization was going to make some really big reforms to both of those. I'm going to dig in on exactly what some of those details were. It was a 644-page document that had a lot of, very nuanced and specific technical changes, but there are some things that stuck out that I think you either knew about and might have been angry or happy about, or really just didn't know about because it wasn't talked about. So let's get into some of these sections. There's a section on commodities that aim to maintain the strength or strengthening of the price loss coverage and also the agricultural risk coverage programs. And these allow the participating farmers in these programs to make a new election between them on these programs. And essentially the programs help manage risks for farmers, including in this is also the dairy risk management. So when a farmer has a bad year or the market's not really good for a certain type of crop or dairy product, this helps ensure the farmers for really bad conditions for their markets with subsidies. Now let's move on to what this program has done for the SNAP program. I think this is probably one of the most highly covered parts of the Farm Bill and one of the reasons why it may have seen a lot of backlash, especially from the Democratic side. The bill would have required that work-capable adults from the ages 18 to 59 participate in a work training or work for 20 hours per week to receive the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, or SNAP, benefits. Yeah, so those are two really huge parts of this bill that had 460 pages of a lot of very technical changes to farming, but the overall portion of the bill was to help farmers leverage their risks in times of hardship, and also to support American farming when it comes to trade and when it comes to producing food for the country, and also for others. But the bill came up to about a $27 billion bill. The CBO estimated that it would cost about $24.3 billion from 2019 to 2023. It also increased direct spending by $3.2 billion over that same period, and $500 million over the subsequent period after that to 2028. So a very expensive bill, but perhaps necessary depending on which side you look on. But I think the major problem found on Democrats who didn't support the bill was the addition of the SNAP provision. We can look at Representative Michael Conway, a Republican from Texas, who introduced the bill. He said that the Farm Bill keeps faith with our nation's farmers and ranchers through the current agricultural recession by providing certainty and helping produce manage the enormous risks that are inherent in agriculture. The Farm Bill also remains faithful to the American taxpayer and consumer. Under the Farm Bill, consumers will continue to enjoy the safest, most abundant, and most affordable food supply in the world, and taxpayers will reap more than $112 billion in budget savings projected under the current law. That's what he had to say, and House Democrats really expressed opposition to this, and their comments were that the act threatens millions of rural and urban Americans, particularly those who rely on our farm and food programs most. The majority's ideology, referring to Republicans, driven reforms to nutrition assistance programs, referring to SNAP, under the guise of a commitment to human dignity, will ultimately leave nearly 2 million current beneficiaries without money to buy groceries. The exclusion of the improvement to farm programs to farm leaves agricultural producers vulnerable to market access, private volatility without an effective farm safety net. So this farm bill has destabilized the historic common ground on which the committee withstood over centuries of sieve changes in favor of leadership-driven politics and perception-based policies. That was the House Democrats' denunciation of this policy. So it failed in the Senate. We'll see if anything else happens to that bill. So there's definitely different opinions on both sides of this, but for now it's dead in the water. Moving on to net neutrality, something that we saw in the news quite a bit this year, and it's reared its head again. The Senate, Republican Senate in the Senate, the Republican Senate by 52 to 47 passed Wednesday the measure to reinstate the net neutrality rules of the Federal Communications Commissions. That rules that they rolled back previously. This is due mostly the Democrats' pushing of this legislation, and it ended up not passing the House. So it's not going to President Trump's desk, but I don't think that's the end of that we'll see of net neutrality, because Democrats began collecting signatures for reinstatement of net neutrality rules as of yesterday. So we'll see they're trying to pull a lot of support behind this idea, and there seems to be a large amount of support, which is why it passed the Senate. It's actually drawn support of half of all senators, including Democrats, and 2 Republicans backed it. So in the House where it stalled, we'll see if any changes come in the coming weeks for the net neutrality rules. And the last bill I want to talk about is the Senate Bill 720, the Israel Anti-Boycott Act. This is a bill sponsored by Ben Cardin with the support of Democrats like Chuck Schumer, would criminalize the participation in certain political boycotts targeting Israel. This is the second time in 2 years that a bill of pretty much the same end has been brought forward. The last time it was changed due to really backlash over it being called unconstitutional. And according to the ACLU, the revised version that was just introduced is still unconstitutional. The ACLU said that it unconstitutionally penalizes Americans who participate in political boycotts of companies doing business in Israel and its settlements in the occupied Palestinian territories if those boycotts were called for by an international governmental organization like the United Nations. I found this really surprising of a bill. It really kind of screams of First Amendment trespasses, and the idea that political boycotts could be penalized is kind of against the whole First Amendment in the first place. If we go back to the NCAA versus Claiborne Hardware, this is a Supreme Court case in 1982 decision where they protected a 1960s boycott of a white-owned business in Mississippi. If this Israel Anti-Boycott Act were to pass and take effect, it would most likely challenge that decision, and I think that's because a lot of organizations like the ACLU, which has already said that if it does pass, they'll definitely consider challenging it in the court. So what it specifically does is it amends the 1970s law known as the Export Administration Act. This law was passed in response to the Arab League's boycott of Israel, which required the U.S. business to boycott Israel as a condition of doing business with the Arab League countries. So to prevent foreign countries from bullying the U.S. businesses into these type of compulsory boycotts, this law prohibits the U.S. companies from entering into agreements with foreign governments to boycott countries friendly to the United States. Whereas the law was meant to protect U.S. companies from having to enter into these compulsory boycotts, the Israel Anti-Boycott Act, this new law, seeks to direct political activities Americans can and can't engage in. So it's trying to tell you whether or not you can actually engage in these activities. So it's a little bit different than saying you can't be forced to engage in a boycott than saying that you can't engage in a boycott. And I think that's the discrepancy that the ACLU especially is pointing to, and other civil liberties groups and activists. So in this new law, of course, Americans can't be imprisoned for their boycott participation, but it does provide that speech critical of Israel can't be used in open investigation, but they could be slapped with criminal financial penalties for such engagements. And it criminalizes the participation in really was constitutionally protected boycotts. It's pretty simple. So that's a pretty interesting bill. We need to see where that goes, and kind of has quite a bit of support on both sides of the aisle, but also is most likely going to see a similar backlash as past versions of the bill did. And it's a pretty straightforward bill, and there's going to be a lot of people on both sides of this issue, but there's definitely a First Amendment argument to this bill, and I think people need to talk about that, and but also acknowledge why the initial legislation was put into place to stop businesses from being forced to participate in a boycott that they don't want, which is completely different than this bill, and that difference should be made and understood. So next week we have the House looking at the Bipartisan National Defense Authorization Act, or NDAA, for fiscal year 19. So we'll definitely be covering that, which is going to spend $708 billion on defense spending. It's a lot of money, and we're going to break down exactly what they plan on spending that money on, but it will go through many changes, and it's always an interesting thing to look at when it comes to some of the other rules within the NDAA, like indefinite detention of Americans, and some other very interesting spending that's going on for defense. So that'll be next week. Thanks for this week in Congress and watching, and we'll see you then.